Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this month's quick conversation. This month, we are actually focusing on fitness to transport. As a reminder, these monthly Zoom and Facebook Lives really serve as an opportunity to connect farmers with different subject matter experts on topics that are important initiatives related to the farm program. So with that, we really want to encourage you guys to ask questions. If you're watching over on Facebook, you can just type those in the chat feature. And if you're on Zoom, you can type them in the Q&A box. And once I ask a few introductory questions, then we'll open it up to the audience to follow up. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. First things first, I'll kick it over to Dr. Edwards-Callaway to introduce herself.
Thanks for having me. I don't think I've ever done Facebook Live, so this is new, but I appreciate the invitation. My name is Lily Edwards-Callaway. I am an associate professor in the Department of Animal Science at Colorado State University. So I teach in the space of animal welfare, and then I also do research, and I really focus on end-of-life decision-making, which is very pertinent to this conversation. And that means for me, on-farm euthanasia. Primarily we work with dairies, and then also I look at the marketing process and then the ultimate kind of end-of-life decision being slaughter as well.
So to kick us off, I guess, start at the very basics, and maybe you can explain, and as a level set, what is fitness to transport?
Yeah, it's a great question because I feel like we don't all have exactly the same definition, and we often talk about, the opposite, what's not fit for transport. But I think fit for transport is an animal being able to go on a transportation journey, be in good physical health, good condition, and really be able to deal with the extra added stress during that process. I mean, we obviously try to reduce transportation stress and handling stress as much as we can, but there's just some things inherent to that system. So an animal being fit is one that can deal with that and cope with that. And then, kind of the opposite of that, unfit, there are some conditions that would make an animal be challenged by them being asked to do that.
And I think looking specifically at the dairy sector on the dairy farm level, why does it matter? Why should it matter to dairy farmers?
So I think, animal welfare always matters, right, to the dairy farmer, to any production system. And so I think even though, this last part of the animal's life is very short relative to the great life that she's been given, it's critical, right? And so it's our responsibility to ensure the welfare of that animal all the way through that process. And so I think it's one, there's just a level of responsibility inherent to owning that animal and then sending it off to become part of the beef supply. If we think, a little bit bigger outside of that, I think there can be some economic incentive to making some of these decisions for fitness for transport a little bit sooner. If the animal can't make it through that journey and doesn't make it to the end, that's a loss. And I know it depends a lot on kind of how it's sold. Ownership changes a lot, which is one thing that makes this process a little bit complicated. But there was actually a fairly recent study out of Canada that looked at cull dairy animals in a sale barn and looked at kind of prices received for those animals, what they're purchased at based on some conditions. And so some things that are associated with fitness for transport, like very poor body condition, visibly sick, actually received lower prices, sale prices based on those.
Then if we look, more towards the end of the process on the plant side, arrival at the plants, what type of issues and what type of impacts maybe related to that economic impact are we seeing from dairy cows?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question because I think sometimes that part of the process is kind of out of sight, out of mind. And so I don't know that when people even know what happens when the animal gets to the plant. I think one thing to back up from the plant a little bit is that journey can be days for the animal. So I think the majority of dairy cows will make at least one stop before actually even getting to the plant. So I think there's a lot of considerations within there, but at the plant specifically, if that animal arrives there, it still has to come off the truck, be handled, be weighed, going to a holding pen where it does receive water, but no feed, generally, unless it's greater than a day, which is pretty uncommon. Be potentially, it's mixed with other animals. And then, although handling facilities are designed for animal behavior and animal movement, they still have to move through that facility. They could walk through a tub into a single file. And so I think anything that just the animal has to exert a little more energy to get through that process. And so if it's already in a compromised condition, that makes it a challenge for the animal. And then it also, I think, is a real added challenge for the employees at the plant. So it's a higher risk having to handle animals that need that extra care. And there's the whole component of regulatory scrutiny at the plant that doesn't exist at other points within the supply chain.
Yeah, and I think you talked about out of sight, out of mind, kind of further down the process. A lot of times in the dairy side, we really focus on milk producing. That's the product we're looking for instead of that change of life, change of career path for that cow. So maybe will you speak to a little bit to what the prevalence of dairy animals there is in the beef supply chain?
Yeah, it's a lot. So I don't know the exact number for the past years, but it kind of always fluctuates for dairy beef. I think around 20% of the total cattle supply slaughtered. And then within that, there's a couple different kinds of dairy beef, right? There's steers in there, and then culled dairy cows. And I think that has fluctuated from like 6 to 8% of that total slaughter. So, I mean, we're talking millions of animals that come into those facilities. And I think generally the other thing, there's many different size plants across the US. And so it depends a little bit on kind of where those animals are being marketed, but the large cull plants, they're very specific to slaughtering culled type animals. And so all those animals are concentrated into one. So it's not like, at one plant, there's only 6% of those cows. It would be a very large percentage of that plant would be cull cows. So I think kind of some of the things we see are just enhanced at those facilities.
Yeah. And so if we look more on the farm side of what we can do as a preventative measures, what type of things or commonalities do you see that you would recommend as starting points for producers who wanted to reduce the risk around fitness to transport?
So I think one thing is proactive decision making, and I know that we all want to do that. I mean, I want to do that for myself, and time is hard to find sometimes. But I think the general population of cull dairy cows going to slaughter are in great condition. They're totally fit to be transported, and that's a great option for them. I think the ones that fall short of fitting into that fit for transport category, I think had the decision been made sooner to ship the animal, it maybe could have gone. And so I think just kind of backing up a little bit and making that decision, or at least assessing the animal for that decision a little bit sooner. I know that complicates, that's complicated, right? It's not, if it wasn't complicated, we wouldn't be talking about it. I think sometimes we are waiting for withdrawals to clear, which is critical. I would say that when we're making those treatment decisions, we kind of consider, is that animal, does it really have a good chance of recovery, or should we just not treat it and send it at that point instead of waiting to then have to wait for that withdrawal time? So the other thing, and I don't know the answer to this, I'd be very curious to hear more about this or hear your perspectives, but there was the study that came out of Canada. I think we make the decision to cull an animal, and then it goes into a pen and waits. It might wait a day, it might wait an afternoon, it might wait several days to go then to slaughter. And I don't know how often we reassess fitness for transport at the exact time that the animal is being transported. So that animal could change a lot, especially those ones that we've made the decision to cull. There's a reason, right? And so that one study in Canada looked at from the time the animal was put on the culling list to the time it was transported. I think the average was like 127 days. There was a lot of variation around that. So it's totally different, probably by farm, by time of the week and everything like that. But I think that's a critical thing, is to actually score these animals at the time they're actually being transported.
Yeah, and not to plug in too much here, but just one thing that made me think about that, those decisions are beyond just the farmer level, the transporter, the pen rider, if they're going to a feedlot situation. We actually are working with Cargill and Elanco to create a training video for all those folks that are a part of that decision-making process that will be out by the end of the year, related to fitness to transport and some priorities there. So a nice plug there, that more is to come on that. I do have a few more questions, but folks that are listening in, if you have questions, feel free to chat those in. I've had a few that have came in as well. One ask from Facebook asked, what percentage of animals I believe that are sent to a plant have issues because of withdrawal?
Because of withdrawal, I don't know the answer to that in terms of a percentage. I do think that in the population of cull dairy cow, that's greater, and they're going to be looked at and tested for a bit more just because of, I think, past performance. So I don't know the percentage, but when they're being inspected, antemortem inspection, I think if there's a cause to, or I guess a reason for the inspector to think that the animal should be tested, then that they do. And so that is definitely a concern. And so I think withdrawal times are critical to follow, but I think that we need to consider when we're applying those treatments, if we even should apply them, because then you're right, we're kind of stuck. The other thing I would say is that even if an animal is within that withdrawal time and they cannot go to slaughter, they can also be euthanized. We don't have to wait just to ship the animal if it's not in a condition that it should be.
Next question asks, is there a way that a dairy could effectively trace their animals to determine the amount of stops or distance it takes between the farm and slaughter?
Yeah, that is a great question. And currently we don't really have any publicly available information on that. What is reported, so the National Beef Quality Audit does record when they do their big audits on the cull population. They do it for finish as well. They record the amount of time that animal was in transit from its last place of origin. So as we all know, and I know why you're asking the question, that's not really representative of that entire journey. So I think that would have to be kind of on an individual farm basis to really be able to track that and make those connections, which I know that's no easy feat to make those relationships throughout the supply chain. I don't know that packers record that data because I don't know that they kind of match up where the kind of seller in the sale barn to where it's then going to the facility. The other thing that I will say is, I know I keep referencing these Canadian studies, but they're amazing. If anyone's interested, it's Stojkov is the first author, and I think were 2021, maybe 2020 papers, but they did follow animals. So they traced animals and they provide a little bit more information in their paper looking at that distance, or not necessarily distance, but time. I think it's, like I said, it's very variable, but they do kind of show, it could be a day, it could be 5 days, it could be 25 days, which I think would be an extreme example, right? But it's days, it's more than we think it is. And so I think there's opportunity to do research, track those individual animals. That's hard, but I think that's probably where we can get a lot of that information, which I would love to have, because I think we have like the piece from dairy to maybe sale barn, and then we have the piece from sale barn to plant, but we can't match them. And there's probably maybe a step in the middle too.
Mm-hmm. Another question asked, is there something that we as dairy can pick up from other commodity groups? I'm assuming specifically animal ag groups, that they have excelled well in the space or made improvements that we should be mimicking?
Yeah, that's a good question. So these are all good questions. In the swine industry, they did start, so there are different challenges, but at slaughter, there's animals, that could be non-ambulatory. Generally, there's a group of animals called fatigued pigs. And so they're ones that just react extremely to the stress of being shipped. Sometimes they become dead. Sometimes they have to be euthanized. Sometimes in pig slaughter, those animals are allowed to rest and recover, which is a little bit different than cattle. But I know a lot of companies did implement a discount for animals like that. So them coming in, they'd be discounted if they sent an animal in that condition, which I think when you put economic incentive around it, I think that really helps at least put a lot more focus on it. One challenge with that, I think, in the dairy beef supply chain is ownership. So at what point do those discounts get, I guess, instituted? And I guess around that, if it's not a discount, maybe it's just not accepting that type of animal. So, if the dairy makes the decision to ship an animal to a sale barn and it's not in a condition that's fit to be received or fit to be transported again, whose responsibility is it to say no to that animal? And I think that's where a lot of the heartache comes in this topic, because I think it's a shared responsibility, but someone has to probably make the first move. And so, we have dairies sending the animals, we have sale barns receiving them, and then we have packers buying them. And so that's, it's kind of promoting poor decision-making really throughout the supply chain.
Yeah. So we obviously on the producer side, on dairy, have the farm program. On the beef producer side, have the BQA program. We've already recognized that there are a few players in this along the chain as well. Question is asking, is there some responsibility on the stockyards, at the sell barns? Do they have an assurance program, as well as do the transporters have an assurance program?
Yeah, so the Livestock Marketing Association, which doesn't have membership of all the auction markets and sale barns, they do have an animal handling program. I have not looked at the most recent version, and there is language around there about euthanasia, about receiving animals, about fitness for transport, and they do trainings. So that's in there. I think there is a lot of, I guess, personal responsibility put to the auction market itself to come up with what those policies around that say. For transporters, there is, I think it's 2018 when the first version came out for the BQA transportation, which I think applies to all types of cattle. And that has had great pickup. A lot of the large packers are requiring that for drivers to ship animals. And actually, I was pretty impressed because I think the driver sometimes gets in a pretty tough position, right? Because the ownership isn't there at all, but they also are responsible for fitness for transport. And so that program actually calls out, I don't remember exactly the wording, but it basically says, hey, you have responsibility in this too, and you can speak up. And it defines some examples of fitness for transport. And then lastly, the packer, so they are the North American Meat Institute Animal Care and Handling Guidelines. That audit tool has been in existence for a very long time. And so part of the transportation audit at the plant side is condition of animals. And so, at a large plant during a third-party audit, they might look at 3 to 5 different trucks arriving, and condition of animal arriving is something that is scored. It only includes like heat stress, calving animals, and I think severely lame animals. Some of the other things that I think we think play into fitness for transport, like extremely engorged udders or emaciated animals, fall a little bit out of that and are looked at, but are considered secondary. That's getting a little bit in the weeds, but point being, it's in there. I think that probably across all the examples I've given, we could make that language a little bit stronger, but I think that the fact we've gotten it into those programs and it's there, and now those programs get reviewed and developed and progress every several years, even every year, some of them. I think that's great progress in that space.
Mm-hmm. A question asked that it specifically asks what's in line more with the farm program standards, but with in general animal care best management practices. Does it make more sense from an animal well-being standpoint to withhold treatment and go ahead and ship an animal so that you don't risk that withdrawal time, or is it to ship it after attempting to resolve a health issue?
So I think that's probably a 100% case-by-case basis, right? And so I think a lot of it has to do, and I am not a veterinarian, so just this full disclosure. I think a lot of it probably has to do with what the issue is for the animal. I think, maybe the thing is, if we think it has a chance of recovery and we want to give it a shot and treat that animal, I think that we need to be okay with making the choice to euthanize the animal if it's not recovering and it's not doing well and it's getting worse, and it needs to be euthanized during that withdrawal time, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And kind of along those lines, we had a question related to euthanasia, and fully recognizing neither one of us are veterinarians, but about taking the emotion part out of euthanasia. Is there anything that you recommend for that, or some way to help in that area?
Yeah, we actually do quite a bit of work kind of working with the caretakers and talking to them about how they feel about making those decisions. I think it's very dairy dependent and the kind of culture around that at the dairies. But I think I think sometimes we take for granted the bond that is formed between dairy caretakers and the cows. I think that, we kind of understand that with companion animals, but I think we don't appreciate that bond in livestock workers. I mean, their job is to care for those animals. And so then when we're asking them to make a decision about timely euthanasia, I don't think that's necessarily an objective decision, right? Because they sometimes, we've had workers share this. They feel like it's a failure if they have to euthanize the animal, or they just, they want to give it one more chance. And so I think empowering those individuals to to share what they're seeing about the animal, but also not necessarily be the ones that have to make the choice to euthanize an animal that they've cared for how many years, right, or months, whatever it is. So I think maybe just awareness of that difficulty for someone in that position would be a step in that right direction, because I think it's a very, very hard thing to do. And I think for the most part, they're not choosing to not euthanize because they don't care. It's because they care so much about that animal. And I think I try to say that in all the groups I talk to, like with students, because I think we sometimes have this different viewpoint of, livestock production versus companion animals, and they're different. But if we're thinking about kind of not making timely euthanasia decisions, I think we have challenges on both sides because of that connection.
Okay. Then another question asked, is there some way, a legal way or another otherwise, that farms that choose to ship animals that are not fit to transport are held accountable beyond, I know we've already talked a little bit about the financial aspect of it, but is there anything else that you see?
Yeah, I mean, so a legal way, I don't know. I think there, maybe a lawyer would understand some process within that. In other countries, it is regulated federally, so there are repercussions for choosing to ship an animal that is not fit to be transported. So, I mean, that does exist. That model exists in other places. It doesn't mean the problem goes away. I think generally we like to be able to regulate ourselves before we add another regulation. But to your point, I mean, I guess it would have to elevate to a certain level to make people feel the need to do that. I think, to me, we've talked about this as an industry for a very long time. And so I think it's just really owning that responsibility. And it might take, a few really progressive actors to do that, to start it. And then I do think it will kind of snowball. But that's a hard step to take. But I think we all know that we have to take those steps. And maybe, I know, Bev, we've worked together on different working groups. I mean, the video that you talked about, and that video, we've gotten buy-in to make that video throughout the supply chain. And so I think projects like that are a step towards where we need to be.
Yeah, and I would add in kind of to the regulation piece that, of course, within the farm program, the current version of animal care, we have the expectation that every farm has a fitness to transport protocol, as well as those actions that are happening on the farm, and that employees making those decisions are trained annually or have reminders annually of what they should be looking out for when making those choices. The last question I have before we wrap up is really just speaking to resources. If someone is looking for some training resources for their employees, or maybe looking for some outside help about making these decisions, where would you recommend them where to go or who to reach out to?
So I would say farm would be like number one for resources. You have some great resources. And then I think, universities, your local university often has extension agents or the animal science department, or you might have a dairy science department. So like, if you're in Colorado, I'm happy to chat. Sometimes there's dairy specialists. I think all the kind of commodity organizations, NCBA has the beef quality assurance program, and that's kind of where the transporter program is housed. I think if you want to know more about the plant side, NAMI is the place to go. And so I think there's a lot there. I think what we're finding, we're making this fitness for transport video. So I think if there's a way to communicate with your farm evaluator or a farm representative and sharing like the resources you need, I think maybe sometimes we don't know exactly what everyone needs. I mean, we can pick the kind of hot topics, which I think is this one, right? So I think sharing with that. Also, the Dairy Cattle Welfare Council, I think, would be a group to kind of go to and engage with. They do have webinars on welfare topics across the board, but I think that could be a resource as it grows as an organization that would have more resources available for dairies.
Mm-hmm. And so if you're looking for those resources for the farm program, it's just on our website, nationaldairyfarm.com. And then that video we will plan to release around fitness to transport training later this year, or by the end of the year. We're almost running out of this year. But thank you, Lily, for your time today. And of course, Lily mentioned that she does work a lot on collaborative efforts when we have crossover between beef and dairy. And so I hope that everyone enjoyed today's session. We will have next month's session on the farm biosecurity new program area. So be sure to tune into that. I hope everyone has a safe rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.